Well, hello everybody. It was supposed to have been one of the most significant aerospace industry mergers in years. But last weekend, the deal that would have seen Boeing take a majority stake in Brazil's Embraer suddenly fell apart. Or at least that's how it seemed to the outside world, because this transaction has been in the works since, well, around July 2018. The plan was that Boeing was going to pay $4.2 billion for an 80% stake in Embraer, which makes regional airliners, business jets, and military aircraft. But the two companies started their protracted courtship before two fatal incidents involving Boeing's 737 MAX aircraft, resulting in its grounding. And the fallout from that has rocked the US aerospace group, battering its balance sheet and causing a crisis of confidence in terms of how the matter's been handled by it and the US regulators. Well, more recently, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has blown a big hole in the big business plans of all aerospace companies, prompting significant decline in the value of both Boeing and Embraer. Well, joining me from just outside New York is my AIN colleague, Gregg, who's been tracking this deal since day one. And in fact, it was his weekend that got disrupted when the news broke on Saturday. So we're going to catch up with him and try and make sense of what might have happened here. So, Gregg, there you were last Saturday morning. I guess you were, I don't know, polishing your golf clubs or whatever you do in your lockdown free time. And then suddenly heard that overnight Boeing had unilaterally pulled out of this merger. Were you as surprised as everybody else? Did this sort of, or had you maybe seen this coming in some way?
Well, I was kind of surprised by the timing in that it happened so suddenly. Really, I mean, I guess it made sense because that was the agreement had expired. The master transaction agreement had expired on that day. But I just kind of lost track of that, to be honest with you. But kind of expected it to be extended anyway, like these things often are.
Yeah, good point. And you mentioned that master transaction agreement. You know, technically the Friday the 24th, I think, was the deadline for that. But as you say, there've been all sorts of other deadlines that had come and gone too. So I think many of us were caught out. And you know, Boeing basically said, well, we're pulling out because Embraer hasn't complied with the so-called requirements of this agreement. And we already know that Embraer hotly disputes that. I mean, do we even know much about what it is that Boeing says hasn't been honored, or is that still a bit of a mystery to us?
I think it's totally a mystery. I've reached out to both companies, and neither one of them has had any comment whatsoever. We know Embraer resents being left at the aisle. I mean, it would be pure speculation on my part to say whether or not this was a matter of money or
anything specific about that agreement, because they just won't tell us, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And there was a thought that the fact that the value of Embraer had fallen so precipitously since the onset of the COVID outbreak, that Boeing decided that it really wasn't worth the $4.2 billion that it had agreed to. You know, it sort of begs the question that they were having all this back and forth negotiation over these many, many, many months. You know, it begs the question, well, at some point, did somebody actually say on either side, well, how about we change the price or something like that? I mean, maybe they did. We don't know. Yeah. But it sort of seems with all this silence and then not really talking about the detail, you know, it does sort of somewhat fuel this theory that this was just a question of Boeing getting cold feet over the marriage, to use your analogy, and just not wanting to go through with it. I mean, that's sort of how it looks to the outside world. As you say, we know that Embraer hotly disputes all this, and indeed, you know, I think it was even before the weekend was over, they'd called in the attorneys and they're saying that they're intending to challenge this in the arbitration process and possibly start looking for compensation. So I guess heaven only knows how long that process is going to run on for. And Gregg, talking of processes, wasn't this deal at the same time still being considered by the European Union's antitrust authorities? And it seemed that process just seemed to be getting pushed back. You know, there was even talk of politics getting in the way. Maybe the EU was holding off because of resentment over the row over Airbus subsidies and the sanctions that had been imposed. I mean, do you have a sense of why that approval process seemed to drag on so long? And, you know, why Boeing didn't seem to be trying to hurry it up? Yeah, well, I know Embraer they've expressed frustration. They had expressed frustration about that whole situation to me a couple of times, because they were spending a lot of money on getting this thing done in terms of the carve out and moving tooling for the business jet manufacturing down in San Jose to another site in Brazil. Meanwhile, it seemed that potential customers, really weren't particularly keen to move ahead with orders for Embraer jets until they were completely confident that this whole thing was going to go through. So not only was Embraer spending money on this whole thing, they weren't getting any sales. They were kind of losing out on both sides of things.
Mm-hmm. And I remember you, during the whole course of this, you did several interviews with senior leaders at Embraer, like John Slattery. And, I remember them being very polite about it and saying, oh, it's not a problem. It's taking too long. We'll be patient. But you're right. Embraer does seem to have shown kind of good faith, and it was trying to make arrangements necessary for the merger to go ahead, but at some cost to itself, really. And I guess what's kind of ironic is that if the European Commission had sort of processed the approval more quickly, the deal probably would have gone through some time ago, and maybe, we wouldn't have reached this point.
Unless there was still outstanding issues that Boeing had brought out. I mean, it's possible that the European Commission could have approved the whole thing, but Boeing still may have had problems with some unmet conditions that they say are still unmet. So it's hard to say about whether that's the case or not, because I know if they had gotten the European Commission approval, that meant that they had all 10 approvals from all 10 jurisdictions that they needed to get them from.
Yeah.
But I don't know if that necessarily would have triggered the signature of the contract.
Good point. There could have still been a holdup.
Yeah, there could have been a holdup still. So
that's interesting. Now, of course, this week Boeing had their first quarter results call, which I know was pretty momentous in terms of some quite bleak numbers that they were reporting. I mean, did they say very much about the breakdown of this deal, or did they comment on that at all in the briefing they had?
David Calhoun, the CEO, essentially parodied what was in the press release. It was a matter of the two sides not being able to reach a satisfactory deal, and really they did not elaborate beyond that. He did not elaborate beyond that. So that's I don't think either company is going to be talking much about this, particularly now that it's in litigation.
Yeah, I'm sure the lawyers are telling them not to comment at all, which would make sense. But one thing that those bleak numbers that you reported at AIN Online showed us was that, perhaps this is just more simple than it seems. And it's just simply the case that Boeing could no longer afford to pay $4.2 billion for a stake, a big stake in a, let's face it, a struggling company. And then, of course, this morning we had more news because we heard that, again, overnight, Boeing, through a bond offering, had managed to raise, I think, $25 billion in cash to keep it going through these tough times. And I got my calculator out and worked out that because of that, Boeing will now have debts of $65 billion in total. I mean, that's no small amount of money, to put it bluntly. So again, maybe who knows? Maybe their financial advisor said, "Look, you've no business to be buying other companies. You need to stick to your knitting and try and get through this." It may have been as simple as that.
Well, I think the immediate cash position is more the issue, to be honest with you.
Right.
Right now, they have $15 billion in cash, or $15.5 billion, I believe, with about $5 billion in short-term debt. The $4.2 billion compared to that is much more significant, I think. There was some talk too about the fact that there was supposed to be a dividend of $1.6 billion paid to Embraer shareholders.
Oh yeah.
Even though it wasn't directly to them, it wasn't a direct payment from Boeing. There was some speculation that it might not have looked very good if Boeing were to take any of the CARES Act money which specifically comes with strings attached that require a suspension of dividend payments.
Yeah.
So maybe that had some influence in this. The word was that the deal would result in synergies between the two companies, that Boeing would benefit from engineering resources that Embraer could offer. The E-Jets would benefit from Boeing's support expertise and their financial reach and their customer reach. But I find it hard to believe that Boeing didn't have the engineering expertise that they need. I mean, even though, they were going into, for example, the NMA, they were talking about they were going to need a lot more engineering.
The NMA, just explain that for people. What do we mean by that?
Well, that's called the new midsize airplane that they have since basically put the kibosh on. They are not going to do it any longer. With everything that's going on, particularly with the 737 MAX situation, they decided to shelve that at least. It may come out in another iteration at some point, but right now the NMA is dead.
But as you say, they're not short of engineering capability. I mean, not that Embraer isn't a very capable company, but it does somewhat beg the question why they'd be stronger together.
Yeah. I mean, to me, I see this as, from the beginning, a much sweeter deal for Embraer than it was for Boeing anyway.
Yeah, which would explain why they're so bitterly disappointed, I suppose. But by the same token, it's interesting. Just a bit earlier, day before, I think it was, that you were listening to the Boeing results, I was listening to the Airbus first quarter results. Of course, Airbus is the deadly rival of Boeing in world aerospace. And, they're also facing tough times, significant cuts in production, and possibly more longer-term downsizing to come from June. So analysts during that call, they asked the Airbus CEO, Guillaume Faury, about the collapse of the Boeing-Embraer deal. He was very tactful. He didn't gloat at all. But he did say how glad he was that Airbus had been able to complete its recent takeover of Bombardier's commercial aircraft business. Now, of course, Bombardier is a Canadian company. It's a rival to Embraer. And, it was noticeable how relatively smoothly that transaction went compared with this Boeing-Embraer deal. So by the same token, I suppose Airbus saw something in Bombardier that added value. Of course, it got what's now called the A220 airliner at the bottom of its range. So I suppose some of these deals do make sense. And he did remark, this is Guillaume Faury, he did remark that Airbus stands to benefit from Boeing and Embraer not joining forces. So maybe these things are seen differently within the sector itself. So Boeing apart and Airbus apart, where do you think, Greg, this leaves Embraer? I mean, in these tough times, can they get by on their own? Do you think they might try and tie up with anybody else? Is this maybe a good time for somebody, to be able to buy their expertise potentially at quite a reduced price?
Well, there has been a lot of talk about the Chinese potentially being a partner. That I wonder about, because Embraer once had an arrangement with the Chinese. At that time, I guess it was Avic, I believe. Yeah. To build legacy jets, and before that, even Embraer ERJs in a factory in Harbin, and it just didn't work out. So I mean, they may not be particularly keen on trying again, but I think there's a natural hesitancy to get involved with the Chinese, and particularly to the extent that they're talking about at this point. But the Chinese have been great suppliers, but of course there is the intellectual property issues.
So could it maybe come down to, the Brazilian government having to help out Embraer, because it is a key national asset for Brazil, I would think? Yeah,
I think that I really think that the Brazilian government is going to have to really come in to just save the company, basically, because they do not want to see this company fail. It's sort of the crown jewel of their industrial base, really. They have mining interests in Petrobras and things like that. But I mean, Embraer is a very technologically sophisticated company, and it's really it's really something that is a source of pride for the country, and it employs a lot of people. I don't see the government, although now with this new administration, who knows what might happen. It's very unpredictable.
Yeah, isn't it just? Well, and I think that's the whole picture we're seeing here. I mean, we already had a fairly unsettled situation. Now COVID-19 has sort of wreaked havoc. I mean, do you think it's fair to say that COVID-19 has created quite a different environment in the aerospace industry that could change the way companies look at these potential mergers? And maybe one of the lessons of this Boeing Embraer episode is nobody really kind of knows the value of anything, that it's kind of hard to engender trust because nobody quite knows what the other side might want. Do you think it could be a slow period for deals because of that?
Well, in the short term, for sure. I mean, traffic is down 95% basically from last year at this time. And I was just listening to the United Airlines call today, and they say that they were planning, not predicting, but they were setting plans for zero revenue through the rest of the year. And that would mean and they want to bring down, and by the end of the year, they want to bring down their daily cash burn to $20 million. And to do that, there's going to be so much more cutting to come after October, which is the time when they're going to be able to start laying people off because they actually accepted COVID relief funds. But who knows what's going to happen after that? I mean, I just see the industry I just see it taking quite a while before the industry gets on its feet again. I mean, a lot of people are saying 3 years, maybe a couple of years later than that before it gets back on its growth trajectory.
Yeah.
3 years maybe to reach 2019 levels again. But I'm not sure if it's going to fundamentally change acquisitions market.
It's pretty distressing. I mean,
Sure
it's almost become routine for us to be covering these stories of downturn. I mean, I don't know about you. I'm getting kind of tired of being the sort of prophet of doom every week and just trawling over this stuff.
Yeah.
But I guess that's our destiny for the while. It seems that way. And I don't know about you. I'm not even sure we've heard the last of this Boeing and Embraer deal. As you say, it's going to court. It could run for weeks, if not months. I don't know. Maybe we'll get lucky and someday we'll actually hear the full backstory. But
I'm sure we will at some point. Once it goes to court, then everything will be public record. So at that point, we'll find out. Well,
thank you very much. Thanks for talking us through this quite confusing story.
Thank you, Charlie. And I appreciate your expertise in this, and hopefully I'm not confused as well.
There you go. Well, it just goes to show if you stick around long enough, like you and I have, everybody becomes an expert in the end.
That's right.
There we go. All right. Well, good chatting with you.
Nice talking to you too.
Thanks for watching this AIN video. Please like, subscribe, and share it if you've enjoyed it. Also, visit AINonline.com for all the latest on the aviation industry.